Hi, Christian. How's it going?
Hi, Miguel. How are you?
Good. Thank you so much for joining. Yeah, it's been great to be chatting with you here, and I think that this time is going to be great for the audience, especially taking into account that mostly everybody is SaaS founder. So yeah, why don't you give a brief intro about yourself, Christian, and about Paddle?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Christian, founder, CEO of Paddle. Paddle builds kind of revenue management infrastructure for SaaS businesses. So basically, we deal with kind of all of the boring stuff that happens that isn't building your product. So subscription billing, payments, taxes, compliance, kind of all of that fun stuff that you have to do in order to have revenue, but isn't necessarily the thing that you want to spend your time focusing on.
Yeah, it is super important. When you started Paddle, like what was the first pain that you saw? And then right now you mentioned that you're doing a ton of things, right? All that stuff that takes a lot of time. You're doing it with Paddle. So how do you go from the initial pain to this full suite of products?
Yeah, so I mean, like my background was I started a software company before Paddle, and I'd scaled it to kind of like 3 or 4 million in revenue, and we were selling a product for not a lot of money. It was like kind of $100 a year or something to at 3 or 4 million revenue to a pretty substantial number of people in pretty much every country you can imagine. And we were a small team and very much like hadn't raised any money, bootstrapped, and were very much in this position of like we were spending all of the time and resource that we would have loved to have been spending with customers and on building products and things like that, figuring out how we deal with like payments or recurring billing, or how do you pay sales taxes in Japan, or like whichever country it was that we were starting to grow in. And then that became kind of super frustrating. It was sort of like I think in the way that like kind of many products are born, like it was really born out of our own frustrations of not necessarily wanting to do this stuff, and there not being kind of adequate tooling that existed for us to kind of outsource it to someone else.
Yeah, absolutely. And how you mentioned that you were spending a lot of time doing things that you didn't really want to, when you wanted to focus on building the business. So also, maybe like a controversial topic, but now in the world there's just so much money around that people are saying just to founders like just focus on growth. What are your thoughts about that? And yeah, like is that true?
I think it's not untrue, but I think it's like a more nuanced like kind of thing than just focus on growth. I think like actually in reality you need to focus on growth in like a measured and sort of like sustainable way, and one in which sort of doesn't necessarily compromise on like the core fundamentals of like kind of building a business. You can't just throw like the rule book completely out the window and focus exclusively on growth. And I think like the way that I think about kind of like the way that we've built this business and sort of like and run is like we've been incredibly aggressive about kind of like our growth ambitions and targets and things like that, but we've always sort of tried to be really capital efficient in how we do those things, and we've tried not to waste money, and we've tried to sort of like be really kind of measured and considered about how we are thinking about growth. And I think that it's a balance. It's like you can definitely go too far in the other direction where you don't necessarily allocate enough sort of capital to growing, which then results in you growing slower, and not seizing an opportunity that might be immediately in front of you. But then there's definitely the inverse where you're throwing kind of good money after bad, and sort of you're chasing growth that doesn't necessarily kind of it's bad customers, or it's sort of it doesn't kind of the revenue isn't well retained, or you're like overpaying for customers or whatever it might be. So I think it's about like kind of I think finding the levers that you really understand, and kind of that you have the data behind, and then throwing as much money as it absolutely like makes sense while that equation still remains true. Throw as much money behind those things that is actually genuinely working and that you genuinely understand.
That makes so much sense. That makes so much sense, right? It is all about measured growth. I mean,
Yeah.
I mean, knowing that every dollar you put in actually is bringing returns, and not just bringing customers that will churn in just a couple of months or whatever. So
Exactly.
Super insightful. When when you're thinking about Paddle and your customers, what are the most important things to consider for revenue management and cash management?
I think sort of like scalability of solution is often like one of the most sort of important things. I think this is a similar kind of story for a bunch of different tools and pieces of infrastructure that people might buy kind of throughout their journey. Is oftentimes you buy the thing that solves the problem that you have right now. Like, because it's sort of, when you think about cash management, revenue infrastructure, whatever it is, you tend to like go to, they're not exactly the problems that you want to be going out and solving every single day. They tend to be the things where you go out and you look for a solution for it, where you have an immediate burning problem in front of you that you just want to solve and then move on so you can do something else. And I think like through that process, you often end up solving the problem that you have right now, but not necessarily the one you're going to have in 6 months time or in 12 months time. And you don't necessarily think through the kind of how future-proof and how scalable a solution to a problem is. And then you unfortunately end up kind of then in market looking for another solution in 6 or 12 months time, like when the business has changed, because you have invested in growth and suddenly you're optimizing for different things. So like, I think the most important thing is actually kind of really considering and playing forward what the business's needs are going to be sort of 6, 12, 24 months into the future, and then kind of buying on the basis of the solution that you're going to grow into, as opposed to the one that just about solves the pains that you have today.
Great point. Yeah, I think scalability is critical, specifically, when companies enter into hyper growth, and then it's just really, it can be hard to focus on a holistic view of the business and just focus on one metric, and then everything else is just shaky foundations. We work with thousands of companies, SaaS companies, and we've seen some stories, where companies are just tracking, for example, ARR growth, but then either that money is not coming in, or they're trying to build a bunch of expired credit cards and things like that, right? So how, like, what are your thoughts about that, and where to focus?
Yeah, it's like hygiene, isn't it? It's sort of like if you're focused on, I don't know, it's like having a sales team that's focused on booking revenue and signing contracts, and then if you never invoice any of those contracts that you signed, then like you might as well have just like lit those on fire. Like, it doesn't really actually matter. So I think like all of these sort of like revenue operations and then just hygiene around a lot of this stuff is, and I think that's largely a lot of the things that we try and take away. Like, in terms of like when we think about like the problems that we try and solve, we try and think of like, what are all of the, like, I think one of the things we talk about a lot in SaaS is like the idea of like having a leaky bucket or something.
Right.
Like, you're putting customers in, you're churning them out for whatever reason. And like, I think the way that we try and think about solving these problems, and I think it's also the way that other people should think about solving their own problems, is like, how do I ensure for every dollar of like new revenue that I acquire, like there's a group of customers that are gonna they're gonna cancel, like they're gonna churn, like that will happen. It's an inevitability in SaaS businesses. But for the group of customers who I'm like, how much of that revenue can I just retain, sort of for all of the reasons that aren't the customer wants to cancel? Because like, there's probably 24 other reasons that you don't end up getting to keep that dollar of ARR or that dollar of revenue. So sort of for all of those things, whether it's involuntary churn, whether it's credit card expirations, whether it's like you invoiced incorrectly, whether it's sort of like you forgot about a renewal, or like whatever it was, like sort of like for all of those reasons, how do we just reduce that subset of reasons down to as few as possible? And then then you can focus all of your energy on the ones that should actually matter, of like, which are the customers that are going to cancel like off of their own volition? Because that might be because they're talking to a competitor, or they're kind of, maybe they didn't realize that you actually had a feature that they needed, and sort of like maybe spending that energy that you were spending on trying to chase up kind of credit card declines, if you'd used that energy on that customer, you would have been able to retain them. So it's all of those things where I think focusing on automating away as many of those problems that don't necessarily need to be a big deal, like they should just be stuff and systems that get handled. So you can, for every dollar in, you can retain as much of that dollar as you possibly can through kind of not having this revenue leakage.
Absolutely. And like, what do you see across the thousands of companies that you work with? Is it that the best companies put these things in place in order to be able to focus on what matters, or that the companies that put these things in place can focus on what matters and become better? What is the order of actions that they see?
I think it depends on. I think that depends on the maturity of the business.
Mm-hmm.
There are certainly businesses, and I think it also, like, there are outliers in every situation. I think there are certainly businesses that succeed in spite of doing this stuff. Like, they don't do any of this stuff. Like, they kind of, but they grow like you wouldn't believe anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, like, those are all of the companies that oftentimes you point to as the excuse for why you shouldn't need to do this stuff. And it's sort of like, the thing that you have to remember is those are the outliers. They've built a very special product, or they've figured out a really special viral mechanic to it, or kind of whatever. Like, back a few years ago, like, a good example of this was Slack. Like, the process of trying to pay for Slack and to try and renew Slack as you went from being maybe a 10-person company to being like a 100-person company, and you needed to, like, get an invoice and do all that stuff. It was all happening almost entirely manually on their side. Like, you would request an invoice and maybe 2 weeks later you get a reply, because they were just so overloaded and they were just growing like crazy. And then you look at these you look at a company like that and you're like, well, Slack didn't do it. Like, why should we? And it's sort of like, for most companies, you're not Slack. Like, you're not going to experience the same thing that they did in terms of going viral in the way they did. And so fastest company ever to like 100 million in ARR, or kind of whatever it is as an enterprise software company. Like, most of the people listening to this aren't Slack. And then, so if we then look at all the other businesses, the ones that truly succeed that aren't Slack are the ones who have optimized for this stuff early. They've figured out the infrastructure. They figured out how they go international. They figured out how they localize that experiences for different buyers. And like, actually, it's less about like how much that enables your growth in the short term, and it's more about like when you actually start hitting those sort of, I think, points of like inflection, you don't have to slow down in order to speed up. Like, and I think that's a thing that often happens is like you just start going on that growth curve, and then you realize that the business has to slow down a bit before you can speed up, because you need to do retooling, or you need to re-implement something, or you don't have the infrastructure to scale. And I think avoiding that bit where you need to slow down is the actual thing that results in a lot of these companies kind of really taking off much faster.
Yeah, 100%. And you know, also having those metrics in the right place, you know, and ordered and visible, it really helps, you know, also to unlock different sources of funding, right? And it's just easier to know what's going on. Yeah.
And I think as well, it's sort of like I think regardless of what type of funding, like, you want to look up, whether it's sort of something like what you guys offer for revenue-based financing, whether it's venture debt, whether it's equity, whether it's sort of whatever, like, the number one, I think, common thing, especially like kind of talking to investors, is they want you to know your stuff, like, when it comes to stuff, and they want to believe that you've done the basic things to avoid you like hemorrhaging money, like, kind of through like system. Like, why, if you can have a process that was sort of 20 or 30% more efficient in terms of dollars in to dollars out, like, why wouldn't you make that optimization? And I want you to make that optimization before I give you any more money, in order for you to kind of optimize that process, because why wouldn't I?
Exactly. What are you guys at Paddle doing to improve, you know, your cash and revenue management?
Yeah, so I think it's interesting because, like, we obviously have to do this for ourselves, but then we also have to do it for like sort of over $1 billion in ARR of other people's kind of revenue as well. And like, we're responsible, and because of the way that we sort of monetizing that we make money on the payment, like, actually us helping our customers manage their revenue more effectively is the thing that ultimately helps us manage ours. So like, we're a huge advocate of when we get a new customer, of helping them fix all of these leaky pots to their sort of like revenue funnel, if you like, to helping them figure out how they deal with involuntary churn, how they deal with things like even simple things like kind of the from a cash management for our customers' perspective, optimizing from, I don't know, like monthly based subscription you want, helping customers sort of, or like our customers encourage their customers to upgrade, and sort of understanding what the incentivization path for something like that should look like so that they can capture that revenue faster.
Yeah, absolutely. And $1 billion in ARR is crazy, right? Like all that's going through your platform so quickly. What are the things in which you see these companies, excelling, and on the other hand, struggling?
I think the ones who really excel, I think this is going to sound really cliche, but the ones who really excel are the ones who you can tell really focus on kind of like building great experiences for customers. Like, I think it all starts there. Like, in terms of like, there is a noticeable difference between the companies who are customer focused and the ones who aren't. And then if you control for that, it's almost like kind of actually sort of the more local an experience, the better the company does. So whether that's local payment options, sort of localization of like for language and currency and things like that, those companies do substantially better. From an involuntary churn perspective, like kind of the cards get declined less, the payments succeed more, the average order values go up, the conversion rate at the point of like kind of free to paid or trial to paid kind of increases. So I think like localization, personalization, and then just like great customer experiences throughout that process. I think honestly, those are probably the biggest things. And then interestingly, there's like 1,000 like really small kind of details that then also kind of in aggregate kind of like apply to I think the outliers on the success side of things. But I think localized experiences and great customer focused companies are the ones that we see just do phenomenally well in comparison.
And the ones you struggle are those pretty much the ones that, as you mentioned, have leaky buckets. They're growing users.
Leaky buckets that don't focus on the customer. I think as well. I think that we talk a lot about like product-led growth, and like when we talk about product-led growth, we think about like how do we make it really easy for somebody to get started using my product? How do we get it like how is getting them to sign up, and then if you're a to-do list app, make your first 8 tasks or whatever? How do we make that process really simple?
Yeah.
And I think that the ones who don't do very well don't think of like that, almost the process of getting a customer to pay, or like the purchase process. They don't think about that as part of the product.
Yeah.
They think about like, oh, I'm going to optimize the product experience. And if the customer has a really good product experience, they're going to deal with or put up with whatever payment experience there is. The companies that, and that's like a real differentiator between the companies that we see being incredibly successful and those who aren't, is the ones who are really successful, they almost like they make paying for the product or signing up for a free trial or entering credit card information or renewing or whatever it is, they make that like feel like a first-class citizen, like those experiences within the product. It's just as nice to do those things as it is to invite a team member or to create a new project or whatever the kind of core action of the product would be. So they just give it a lot of focus.
Amazing. And Christian, you started, Paddle a few years ago when SaaS was like not even that cool. Right now SaaS is exploding, and it's like everybody loves SaaS. We love SaaS. That's why we started Capchase as well. But what attracted you so early to the industry, and why you decided to focus on something so fundamental?
Yeah. So we started Paddle in 2012. So SaaS wasn't cool. It's definitely become more cool over time. I think for us, it was sort of like the first software company that I built was selling downloadable software on the Mac. And it was like one-time purchase. And it was this model of like, you pay $50 for this thing. And then maybe a year later, version 2 comes out and you pay another $50 and you get the new version, or you can just not pay it. You can stay on the old one. And I think around like, and sort of, I come from that like community of like people who are building kind of like desktop and eventually like mobile software as well. And the biggest frustration, like in that community of people, you talk to any of these developers, was add a new feature that they knew would help them sell a bunch more copies of the app, but they had to wait until version 2 to release it, which was in 6 months' time, because if they released it in version 1, nobody would buy version 2.
Yeah.
And like that's when, for me, and I think for a bunch of other people around the same time, the light bulb went off. It's like, if we get all of these people to pay on a subscription, we can release the coolest functionality all of the time and really delight these customers. And I think like it was this case of like, how do we align the way that a customer is paying for a product with like truly the value that we want to provide as the people making the product. Like in SaaS now, we never have those debates like about like, should we wait until like next year to ship this thing that we've already built and it's already done, because like otherwise customers aren't going to pay for it. And it's sort of like, no, we just ship it to the customer when it's ready and they have a better experience and the product gets better over time. So that was the thing that initially got me excited about subscriptions in SaaS, and sort of it's cool now to see sort of exploding and like tons of people like kind of jumping on and building great subscription software companies.
That's a really interesting point, and I mean you've seen it explode, which is fascinating. And I was actually going to jump to one of the questions in the audience, because SaaS, when SaaS started as a service, they turned all the on-premise software that you're mentioning into subscription, and now there's like more and more. There's plenty of companies from, let's say, the normal economy trying to get into subscriptions as well, right? What are the core? What are these people after? First of all, what are these companies after, and then what do you think about the potential of those new companies going into the recurring business?
I think what they're after is pretty obvious. I think they're after recurring revenue because it's like the holy grail of like being able to build a business and predictability. I think that there is, I think like just because subscriptions exist doesn't mean that everything should be subscription. And I think that's sort of, and I think subscriptions make a ton of sense for B2B. They make a ton of sense for B2C in the context of types of products that you use very, very frequently. But sort of there's a lot of things as well that you don't use very frequently as well. And I think there is this like subscriptionification of the world like happening. I think that the most interesting thing is actually navigating that from a business side of things, of like being a business that runs perpetually licensed or like one-time license or on-prem or like whatever it is. And it can be, there are obviously like software things, but then there's also like physical world things that this is happening for as well. But like the managing a business through a transition of moving to subscription is actually really hard, because you go from having these things that are probably really expensive, paid all up front, to having a thing that is much cheaper, paid over a long period of time. And we saw this because like when we started Paddle, like, and we ourselves were kind of doing this kind of like, I was excited about this transition to subscription. And then like our first customers were a bunch of these companies who were selling products one time and then wanted to transition to subscriptions because they saw like the light at the end of the tunnel many years like later. But like the biggest challenge for those businesses is how do you go from being maybe like, we had one kind of customer who, it's definitely an app that everybody on this would recognize if I said the name, and I don't know if he wants me to share the story, so I won't say the name. But they went from being a $5 million business, like $5 million a year business selling perpetual like one-time licenses of this product, to being $1 million ARR business sort of like 3 weeks after they switched to subscription, like which results in like that's $4 million going away like overnight, because the price point of this is much lower. They had the same number of customers, but eventually like that started to compound, and a few years later they were like a sort of a much larger business than they were previously. But I think for a lot of these people trying to transition into like subscriptions, dealing with that big gap in the short term, I think is sort of a really interesting challenge. But I think the interesting thing is sort of once you've made the transition and you are the 1 or 2 million ARR business that's come down from 4 or 5 million, but it's now recurring revenue, you have access to all of these different kind of instruments and ways of funding the business that you didn't have access to when you were a non-recurring revenue business. So it's like you can now access all of these different things, be it things like Capchase, be it sort of other solutions, be it revenue-based financing, be it debt, be it.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So actually, that was one of the realizations that we had when we started. We were working in SaaS for 3 years, and that was exactly what we were facing. We didn't go from on-premise or one of two SaaS. We started from scratch, but then we saw something similar, where every time we signed up a customer, we spend a ton of money signing them up and getting them installed and so on. And instead of getting all the money up front, we just have to wait. Right. So at the beginning, when you have a customer, you're like, oh my God, I'm going to burn money for 6 months until I start making $1. But then when you get 2 and 3 and 4, you're even burning more and more money, and then suddenly starts to compound, and then the economics totally switch. Right. So that's where we start.
As soon as you hit that point, then like you feel like the smartest person in the world. As soon as you hit that, like you cross the thing where it's paid for itself. And then it kind of continues into perpetuity, and it's great. And then everything before that is a lot of despair of like, let's make sure they don't cancel before that moment.
Exactly. All right. So we only have a couple minutes left. So just wondering, if you had any last thoughts or anything else for the audience around, cash, revenue management?
No, I think we covered like a ton of stuff here. I'd say, I think the big things when thinking about revenue management are like a bunch of the things that we talked about today in terms of thinking about optimizing this stuff early. I think the bigger of a business that you become without optimizing for this stuff, the harder it is to optimize for this stuff later. Right. The harder it is to fix involuntary churn when you're a 10 million ARR business versus when you're a 1 million ARR business. Sort of whatever changes you try and implement, like these things just get more complicated. The problems get more complicated to solve over time, but if you solve them early, the solutions tend to last for a long time. And I think once you have that, I think like it pays to figure out a lot of this infrastructure early, purely from a data reporting and things like that basis as well. Like if you get that stuff in shape early and then the business grows, I think you have a lot more optionality when it comes to other kind of tools and services and financing options and things like that you want to use later, if you have that kind of like hygiene in place kind of as early as possible in the businesses. So those are probably the couple of things that I would mention on kind of revenue management specifically and what to focus on.
Good point. As you show, with a lot of things in life, right? It's better to start early and then to fix things. Yeah. 100%. Thank you so much for your time. Cool. It was great to know about what you've done for the SaaS industry. Thank you. So I'll hand it to Maria.
Thank you so much, Christian. I really love the word of advice of trying to automate revenue operations as much as possible so you can really focus on the growth function of the business and not lose all the hard work. And that at the end of the day, revenue, health, and hygiene can make the fundraising process a lot more seamless. So thank you so much for your word of advice.
Thanks for having me.